Hello and welcome to the Data Engineering Podcast, the show about modern data management. When you're ready to build your next pipeline and want to test out the projects you hear about on the show, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so check out our friends over at Linode. With their managed Kubernetes platform, it's now even easier to deploy and scale your workflows, or try out the latest Helm charts from tools like Pulsar, Pachyderm, and Dagster. With simple pricing, fast networking, object storage, and worldwide data centers, you've got everything you need to run a bulletproof data platform. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/Linode today, that's Linode, and get a $100 credit to try out a Kubernetes cluster of your own. And don't forget to thank them for their continued support of this show. Modern data teams are dealing with a lot of complexity in their data pipelines and analytical code. Monitoring data quality, tracing incidents, and testing changes can be daunting and often takes hours or days. Datafold helps data teams gain visibility and confidence in the quality of their analytical data through data profiling, column-level lineage, and intelligent anomaly detection. Datafold also helps automate regression testing of ETL code with its data diff feature that instantly shows how a change in ETL or BI code affects the produced data, both on a statistical level and down to individual rows and values. Datafold integrates with all major data warehouses, as well as frameworks such as Airflow and dbt, and seamlessly plugs into CI workflows. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/Datafold today to start a 30-day trial of Datafold. Once you sign up and create an alert in Datafold for your company data, they'll send you a cool water flask. Your host is Tobias Macy, and today I'm interviewing Tejas Manohar about Hightouch, a data platform that helps you sync your customer data from your data warehouse to your CRM, marketing, and support tools. So Tejas, can you start by introducing yourself?
Hey, I'm Tejas. I'm one of the co-founders of Hightouch. As Tobias said, we help companies sync data from their data warehouses into sales and marketing tools, specifically customer data. And we do this with a super simple interface, which is just SQL. Essentially, you paste a SQL query into Hightouch, and we tell us how this data should appear in downstream systems that your business teams use, like Salesforce or even Facebook ads. And Hightouch handles all the data plumbing work of getting it into the tools, so you can just focus on the data.
And do you remember how you first got involved in data management?
Prior to founding Hightouch, I actually worked at Segment for quite a while. And Segment provides an API for companies to track all their customer data in a unified way through a central API and a bunch of libraries for different clients, like websites, backends, mobile apps, etc. And that's how I got into the whole customer data, data engineering, and also MarTech space. So I joined there as an early engineer, about the 8th or 10th engineer at the company back in 2016, and then worked there until mid-2019 when I actually left. And recently the company was acquired by Twilio.
And so you gave a bit of an overview about what it is that you've built at Hightouch. Can you give a bit more background about your motivation for turning that into a business and some of the story of getting it off the ground?
At Hightouch, basically a trend that I noticed while I was actually at Segment was that the one place where companies are centralizing all their customer data is not a SaaS tool like Segment or a particular vendor, but it's actually their own data warehouse. Especially with all the recent advancements in the data warehousing space, with new data warehouses coming out like BigQuery and Snowflake. So generally, companies are centralizing all their customer data into the warehouse because of these new data warehouses, which allow you to own your data and access it very quickly, but also because of the whole wider ecosystem around the data warehouses. There's plenty of new BI tools on the market. There's tons of ETL providers that help you get data from various SaaSes into your data warehouse, like Segment and Fivetran. And every single player in the whole marketing and analytics space is basically centralizing around the data warehouse as the one place to export data. So what I found is that data warehouses at all types of companies, B2C, B2B, even newspapers, were using the data warehouse to centralize all their customer data, but they were all using it for analytical and BI and reporting use cases. What we're trying to do at Hightouch is say that now that you have all your customer data inside of your actual data warehouse, why stop at using it to answer questions? But you should actually use it to power operational use cases, both in the day-to-day of your business teams, whether that's like sales or marketing or support, and also things like in-app personalization in your actual product experiences. So that's our goal at Hightouch, to basically shift the data warehouse from something that's seen as just a repository of customer data for analytical use cases to something that's actually seen as a repository of customer data for operational use cases. And I see this as such a big opportunity because every company we talk to, there are so many scripts that are being created on an ad hoc basis to just get data from one system to another and do all these point-to-point integrations, like get data from Salesforce to HubSpot or HubSpot to Marketo, and all these random point-to-point integrations that I think could be better served if they're built directly on top of the data warehouse, where you have the power of SQL to manipulate this data freely in a way that's accessible to much more than engineers. And all your customer data is already in the central place, the data warehouse anyways. So at Hightouch, our goal is to eliminate workflows where business teams are uploading CSVs that are manually exported from BI tools on a daily basis, and also where engineers are having to write tasks to just get data from one system to another, with a simple interface that allows you to take the results of any SQL query and automatically stream it into systems like Salesforce or HubSpot or Facebook ads or 30 plus other tools in a way that's super flexible.
For business users who are relying on some of these different SaaS platforms for tracking various aspects of the customer lifecycle or understanding the needs and desires of the customers based on the customer acquisition that they're doing, whether it's from entries in Salesforce for people who are entering based on customer engagement or people who are streaming in clickstream data, click tracking data from things like Segment or Google Analytics. What are some of the main points of friction that those users and teams are facing when they try to actually make use of the customer data that they're collecting through these various avenues?
Yeah, it's a great question. So one of the most common use cases that we see Hightouch solve are use cases in the marketing department in terms of business teams that get benefit from Hightouch. So while the user of Hightouch is a technical user, like someone who can write SQL, connect to the data warehouse, and actually figure out what data should go to what business system, the person who ultimately receives the benefit from Hightouch is generally someone on a business team. And we find marketing is the largest business team that's affected. The way that marketing is affected is you can imagine that I'm a marketer at a B2C company or even a B2B company, and I'm sitting in my end marketing tool that allows me to send emails to certain groups of customers and manage all the content for those emails. Think something like Iterable or Salesforce Marketing Cloud or Marketo. And when I'm in this tool, I want to actually pick users to be targeted based on certain criteria about them. So as an example, if I'm at an e-commerce company, I might want to target users who added an item to their cart that was worth over $1,000, but didn't check out that item. This is a pretty common campaign. But sometimes marketers don't actually have the data inside of their end tool, whether it's the item's price, that step in the funnel, the events the user took, the user's name, to actually build the segment using that tool's segmentation builder to target certain users within their email platform. So what they do is they have two options then. One, they can go to an analyst and they can ask them to pull them a list of users that should be targeted in this campaign as a CSV and then go upload it to these tools. You can't imagine how many times we actually see this happening, even at companies with pretty sophisticated data stacks. The second option that they have is actually to go ask an engineer to modify the tracking code that's getting data into these tools, whether it's a script that gets data into Marketo or whether it's a call from the front end of their website that gets data into Marketo. And basically what Hightouch allows is it allows anyone who has access to that SQL query or access to someone who can write that SQL query that can pull a one-off list of users to essentially automate that SQL query or operationalize that SQL query. So the marketer can ask the analyst to not just give them a one-time CSV that they have to keep refreshing in their tool or asking it. Instead, they can ask them to paste that SQL query inside of the Hightouch UI and say how that data should show up in downstream systems like Marketo. Hightouch handles all the regular syncing of the data. So really what we replace is marketers, salespeople, support people having to ask engineers for one-off scripts to get data into their business systems or analysts for one-off CSVs.
And so you mentioned that the primary interface for the people who are the end users of Hightouch is actually for more technical staff and people who are familiar with SQL, and that the primary teams that are benefiting from the output of Hightouch are people in things like marketing and possibly sales. So I'm wondering if you can just talk through some of the ways that those different user profiles and the interaction patterns that you've seen have influenced the overall design and product prioritization of what you're building at Hightouch.
Due to the diversity of use cases for customer data around the organization, there's actually different access patterns that we support inside of our tool itself. So just to give you one example, some email marketing tools like Marketo or like Iterable, for example, have pretty sophisticated data platforms within them that allow you to segment users based on various conditions, like Boolean conditions or kind of event funnel conditions, like a user did this and then they did this, or a user did this and then they did not do this. Whereas some other tools, like Facebook ads, don't have that much sophistication around how you can segment users based on your first party data inside of their platform. So what we find is that the way people use Hightouch for some tools that do have sophisticated data platforms is that they get raw traits about their users into these platforms and then do the segmentation inside of the platform itself, like use Marketo to build Boolean conditions off of these raw traits, like what's the age of the user or what step of the funnel did they leave off at from the warehouse. And then with other platforms like Facebook ads, which don't have as much of these data sophistication within their own platform, we actually find that companies are just syncing lists of users that meet certain conditions from the data warehouse into platforms like Facebook ads. So essentially just automating the upload of a SQL query as a CSV into the system. That's just a list of users to target rather than the raw data about them to then manipulate in a tool like Facebook ads. So there's a lot of different ways that the product can be used based on how the actual destination tools that you're using the business data inside of support manipulating data within their platforms and the use cases. We like to focus on marketing in particular, not because marketing is the only business team within the company that can leverage customer data, but we find that it's the business team that leverages the most amount of customer data on a regular basis. So we think it's a pretty interesting and wide open opportunity. That said, there are use cases across other teams, like sales, for example. A lot of B2B SaaS companies that have a bottoms-up adoption process where users are signing up individually on their sites, but they also have an enterprise sales process where they're reaching out to accounts that are heavily utilizing the platform and trying to get them on a corporate contract. A lot of these companies also use Hightouch. And what they do is that they sync metrics about how their product is being used by their users into their CRM, like Salesforce, which is traditionally only armed with metrics like when's the last time the salesperson has contacted this user. So now with Hightouch, we basically supercharge their CRM with information about how those users are not just being contacted by the salespeople, but how they're actually using the product. For example, when's the last time they logged in, or how many API calls did they make this month? And with that insight, the salespeople can both better target users amongst the whole customer base to prospect which ones to focus on and try to upsell, as well as get visibility into what customers are actually doing right from within their CRM when they're entering a call. So there's a lot of different interesting ways that customer data can be utilized across the organization. And sometimes what data is actually being synced to a destination depends on the team that's going to consume that data, but sometimes it also depends on the limitations of those downstream tools that you're syncing data to.
In terms of the actual attributes and records that you're able to propagate to these downstream systems, what are some of the data modeling considerations that users need to factor in terms of what attributes are required, which ones are optional, what systems accept which records and the types of records, and the source data that you need to be able to collect to effectively populate these downstream systems with the information that's being required?
Yeah, so more or less the way it works in Hightouch is that you select all the data that you want to appear in these downstream systems via just a simple SQL query. And then when you're actually telling Hightouch to send that data to a downstream system like Salesforce, that's when you specify how you want it to appear in that downstream system. I'll take Salesforce as an example because it's one of our more popular integrations, both on the B2B and the B2C side, and because it's very robust and horizontal in terms of the use cases of it. So Salesforce has hundreds of built-in objects, and in addition to that, you can also have custom objects. And these objects range from things like leads to contacts to accounts to even custom objects like billing reports for the month that a SaaS company might be using inside of their Salesforce. And each of these objects is almost like a table in a database. It can have different constraints, required fields, nullable fields, types, etc. Hightouch does the heavy lifting of making sure that the data you're picking from the data warehouse matches those constraints in terms of selecting required fields, selecting fields with types that are compatible between SQL and Salesforce. And it basically goes very deep in each of these integrations to make sure that the end user doesn't have to be aware of how the integrations work. They can just use the actual UI to make sure that they're handling all these constraints when loading data into them. So we don't actually require your data to be in any particular format inside of the data warehouse, which is what I think is one of the really most powerful pieces of the model we've chosen for Hightouch of building this data integration solution on top of the data warehouse. Instead, if there needs to be any transformation to get data into the right format to end up in a system like Salesforce, then you can actually do that transformation in SQL itself, which is a super powerful language for doing all this transformation. We find that our customers are about split in terms of how they use the Hightouch product. Half our customers paste extremely complicated SQL queries into the Hightouch product. These are queries that might have 10 joins, a bunch of where clauses, many functions to transform data, splitting things up like full name into first name and last name as an example. And then the other half of the users just have a select star from a view or table that exists in their data warehouse inside of Hightouch. Basically, the people in the first camp generally aren't doing much cleanup on the actual data after they arrive in the warehouse. They're just kind of manipulating the data inside of each SQL query as an ad hoc process, whether that's for analysis or for use in Hightouch. The people in the second camp that are just doing a select star from a tabular view, they are generally using software like dbt, which is data build tool, which helps you manage SQL views, whether they're materialized as tables or as views inside of your data warehouse with just SQL. So they're either using software like dbt to basically do post-processing on all the data that's in their warehouse and clean it up into an accessible format, or they're using some sort of Airflow workflows or in-house versions of things like dbt, we actually see pretty often, before they use Hightouch on top of that data. And then they just have a select star inside of Hightouch. So the nice part about Hightouch is that we make it really seamless to connect data in your data warehouse with all these downstream tools, because we think about all the constraints and issues that might come up when you're actually syncing data into those downstream tools for you and warn you about them. But at the same time, we don't enforce our data model of what your user data should look like on top of your data warehouse or on top of your actual business systems, because we know that every company is unique. So instead, we let you do all the transformations you want, both in terms of transforming the data to be in a certain format or kind of transforming the data model to be in a certain format in SQL itself.
And as far as the actual Hightouch platform, can you dig a bit into how it's architected and some of the ways that the system has evolved or changed since you first began working on it?
So in terms of how the Hightouch platform works, at the simplest level, you can imagine that we have a platform where you can create queries, paste a SQL query into there, connect it to downstream tools like Salesforce, Mixpanel, HubSpot, tools like that, and say how the data should look between the SQL query and the downstream tool. Basically, what we do is that we run that SQL query against your data warehouse on a schedule that's configurable by you, or it can even be triggered by workloads that are happening in your dbt or in your Airflow. And then what we do is, before sending it to any of these downstream tools, we take a diff on the data. So we compare it to take this diff, we basically compare it to what we loaded from your data warehouse the previous time to see what are the changes, the removals, the additions to your data before syncing it to any downstream destinations like Salesforce or Facebook, for example. And that helps avoid a lot of concerns around hitting rate limits in these tools or overwhelming them or using up all your API credits and making you pay a bunch of money to tools like Salesforce. So Hightouch tries to think about all these stuff for you that you wouldn't necessarily think about if you're writing like a simple Python script that you're running on a cron job. And in terms of how the architecture has evolved over time, there are a couple things that we've prioritized. So one of them is actually helping companies own their own data. And what I mean by this is, while Hightouch is a SaaS service that you just use by going to app.hightouch.io, we actually have an architecture that allows all the customer data to remain in your own infrastructure. So this means all the customer data can actually remain in your own infrastructure, spread across your own data warehouse and your own Amazon or Google or Azure S3 or object store bucket. And we've really prioritized that architecture because we believe that with increasing regulation, privacy concerns, security concerns across all industries in the market, there's a large opportunity to let companies own data and their own infrastructure while still having the ease of using a SaaS service. So that's something that we prioritized pretty early on, but didn't have in the very initial version of Hightouch because we didn't know how big of an opportunity that was. And that's unlocked us to work with a lot of larger clients much before usual companies in this space would have. And I think the really unique thing to emphasize there is we allow you to own your data without actually being an on-prem service. In that by using the data warehouse, the data lives in your environment, but Hightouch isn't built in a way that you actually have to run the Hightouch platform or the code in your Amazon EC2 instance or in your own server, which has a lot more overhead as a user. So this hybrid architecture is something that we're really proud of. Another thing in terms of how the platform has evolved is really just the integrations platform. Over time, we've definitely grown the sheer number of integrations, and that's something that we are just constantly continuing to do. But with that, we've also increased the robustness of the integration platform itself quite significantly. We have a lot of central abstractions within Hightouch's backend that define how data is queued up before it goes to downstream systems. In addition, central abstractions for things like error reporting to the user, monitoring, logging. And this is something that we plan to invest more and more in as Hightouch scales, because we want there to basically be like no concerns that you would have thought of if you were developing your own scripts to get data into systems like Salesforce that you wouldn't have thought of if you're using Hightouch. So I would say the two main places that the architecture has evolved so far has been one on the hybrid architecture and making sure that Hightouch can be run in a way that companies really own their own data and it doesn't have to leave their environment. And two, the integrations platform, and just making that more and more robust in a way that keeps providing benefit to Hightouch as we build more and more integrations in the platform, because we know we're in the business of building integrations. In terms of future-looking roadmap, where I think we're going to have a lot of innovation is going to be on the developer experience side of Hightouch. So we're actively working on making Hightouch an amazing developer experience, building deeper integrations with other software in the ecosystem, like dbt, Looker. We have some innovation on our own modeling layer that's coming out as well as bringing concepts like CI/CD testing, dry running software, like kind of simulating what would happen when you run this workflow against your Salesforce account to Hightouch. Traditionally, analysts, business users, and non-engineering users don't think about these things in the same way that engineers do. But by giving people who are usually just used to querying data the ability to automate that data by automating a SQL query, that's also a lot of power and things that can go wrong in your business systems. In that, an analyst pasting a SQL query into Hightouch and setting up some settings now could create millions of records in your Salesforce account unexpectedly if Hightouch isn't configured properly. So I think there's great opportunity looking forward to basically bring concepts like CI/CD, QA, dry running software, sandbox environments into the Hightouch platform and teach companies a new way of doing this without having to loop engineers in and still keeping it declarative around SQL.
Some of the interesting aspects of the integration with some of these other systems, particularly when you were talking about being able to track deleted objects or the issues around compliance with things like GDPR. I'm wondering if you have the ability to do things like track deleted customers because they may have requested that their information was removed for GDPR reasons, and then being able to then remove those records from the downstream systems to ensure that their information is scrubbed from all the places where it might have been propagated to.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up. That's actually an area that we don't touch on too much in our marketing content right now, but it's actually a huge benefit of the Hightouch platform. Essentially, we do propagate more than just insertions and updates into the customer data that you're querying in the data warehouse, but we also have the ability in our platform to propagate deletions to this customer data, which creates a really interesting setup and vision if you're thinking about, from the lens of a CIO at a really large company. You have all these problems where you're sending customer data to all these different business systems, but there's no clear place to see the lineage of that customer data as in where did this definition come from, or also manage the governance of that customer data as in when a GDPR request comes into your business, How do I make sure it's deleted from all the systems? So there's this interesting vision that we can start to paint with a system like Hightouch, operationalizing your data from a central store, which in this case is the data warehouse, where if you delete data from that central store, or if you mark it as deleted, we can actually propagate that to all the downstream tools like Salesforce, Marketo, Facebook ads, etc., to make sure that that GDPR deletion request was handled throughout the stack. Deletions is something that we've actually thought about from day one with Hightouch, and we're really excited about that vision, being able to do both data lineage in terms of figuring out what does this field in Salesforce actually mean. Well, it means it's from this view in your data warehouse, which is pushed to Salesforce an hour ago, and that's actually built up out of these other 3 views that came from this DAG inside of dbt. So that's one aspect of it, but also the governance aspect of it, which basically says when we delete a particular attribute or row from the data warehouse due to this GDPR request, that cycles through all of these materialized views, all of these BI reports, but also all of these downstream systems that are traditionally implemented in a fragmented way. So yeah, that is one of the huge benefits of Hightouch, and we think that's something that we're going to really capitalize on long term as companies move their whole stack to Hightouch. Right now, we go into organizations and we let them solve one-off data problems in their stack without moving their whole stack into Hightouch. But once you're using Hightouch throughout your company and all customer data is actually flowing from the warehouse into other business systems, then there's a lot of opportunity to just have a central interface where all this data is really governed.
Today's episode of the Data Engineering Podcast is sponsored by Datadog, a SaaS-based monitoring and analytics platform for cloud-scale infrastructure, applications, logs, and more. Datadog uses machine learning-based algorithms to detect errors and anomalies across your entire stack, which reduces the time it takes to detect and address outages and helps promote collaboration between data engineering, operations, and the rest of the company. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/Datadog today to start your free 14-day trial. And if you start a trial and install Datadog's agent, they'll send you a free t-shirt. In terms of the actual efficiency of being able to keep up to date with all the changes in the data warehouse, I know that for source systems like application databases along the lines of Postgres or MySQL, there's a lot of movement in the change data capture space. I'm wondering what the availability of interfaces like that are for some of the data warehouses that you're working with and some of the ways that you're optimizing for keeping up to date with those various change sets. And as you mentioned, being able to understand some of the throttling requirements for the downstream systems and doing things like cost optimization on the data warehouse as well, so that you don't, particularly for things like BigQuery, you don't execute queries on maybe a polling basis, and just sort of reducing some of the cost overhead on that side as well.
So change data capture, or CDC, is something that we're really excited about as something that's becoming more and more common and popular in the data warehousing space. So just for anyone in the audience who doesn't know what that is, in particular, some of the data warehouses like Snowflake are coming out with new features that are basically called change tracking or change data capturing or streams. So in particular, Snowflake calls it table streams. And essentially what that allows you to do is track changes, whether they're inserts or updates or deletions, or even metadata changes like DML on the actual tables that you have in Snowflake, and then operate on that stream to send data to downstream services, create new tables, do anything like that. It's kind of like a more robust form or non-transactional form of triggers that you might have in a OLTP database like Postgres or MySQL. So right now, primarily the way that Hightouch does this sort of diffing of the data is by actually calculating the difference either in SQL in your own data warehouse or in our end via just doing a streaming difference between essentially 2 files. One is coming from the data warehouse and we're streaming it down, and one is from the S3 bucket, whether it's owned by Hightouch or whether it's owned by your own company in your own AWS cloud. That being said, CDC is something we're super excited about to make this process more efficient, and actually not just more efficient from a computational perspective, but to also be able to unlock new use cases in the long term that would benefit from lower latency of pushing data out of Hightouch. into downstream systems. So today, there are CDC features in some of these data warehouses. For example, Snowflake has table streams, which can work on an actual table that's been materialized inside of the data warehouse. In addition, they have incrementally computed materialized views, where basically generally materialized views created in the data warehouse are just kind of refreshed on a schedule. You can call a command like refresh materialized view, and it'll rerun the SQL query and save the results as a table. But Snowflake and some of these data warehouses are also coming out with incremental versions of this feature that can process that SQL query incrementally instead of computing the whole thing every time in batch. So we're really excited about both of these features. And streams is something that we're already starting to utilize inside of the Hightouch platform today. Incrementally materialized views is something that some of our customers are utilizing inside of their Snowflake, which we're consuming, but we don't do anything special around that today. That said, a lot of these features as they exist in the data warehouses today come with a lot of quirks or caveats. For example, table streams can only operate on a table itself that's materialized. A lot of companies using Hightouch query views or paste more complex SQL queries, as I mentioned, into the Hightouch platform, so we wouldn't be able to use table streams in that case. And then in addition, incrementally computed materialized views inside of Snowflake don't support certain things like joins as it stands today. So if you join, then it actually can't compute that materialized view incrementally anymore in either BigQuery or in Snowflake. So we're really excited about the potential here because we think that there's no reason, no theoretical or no computer science reason, I guess, that these data warehouses shouldn't also be able to operate as a streaming platform, still using SQL as the interface. That said, we acknowledge that there are bottlenecks in just the progress that these data warehouses have made. And it's going to take a couple years, we think, until our customers can truly utilize the streaming features of these data warehouses across the board. There are some exciting companies in this space, though. For example, Materialize.io is a company that we're super excited about. They are working on a streaming data warehouse from ground up, where streaming SQL was the first thing thought about in this data warehouse rather than in Snowflake and BigQuery and Redshift. Amazon, Google, and Snowflake are kind of thinking of streaming as an afterthought to their existing batch-based systems. So we're really super excited about them. We're super excited for them to have some sort of cloud offering. We've built kind of experimental connectors into Materialize on our end, but we don't have any customers using them today. And we think when streaming becomes mainstream, there's going to be a lot of potential for more use cases of Hightouch. For example, some companies are using Hightouch to push insights from their data warehouse, like a propensity score, the likeliness to buy score from their data warehouse into their production databases today, like Postgres, to then use in their front end or customer experience to actually change the customer experience that a user is facing. And the problem with this is that those propensity scores can only be computed hourly or every 30 minutes or something in batch in an efficient way. But with streaming SQL, it would be amazing if there was a unified interface where this data could be computed in real time or near real time in a way that doesn't waste a bunch of compute resources and have to scan the data over and over and over. Because then things like real-time personalization could be done directly off the data warehouse, orchestrated by something like Hightouch. So in a nutshell, we're super excited about CDC. We're already starting to add some CDC-like features into our platform today, but the data warehouses aren't at a point where we can just rely on them for CDC. So we have to do a lot of the diffing ourselves.
And in terms of the upstream data sources that are necessary for Hightouch to be useful and effective for the people who are trying to use it for the downstream use cases for these different SaaS providers, what are some of the common and kind of core competency upstream systems that are necessary for populating the data warehouse to allow Hightouch to be able to be used effectively?
This is a really interesting question because basically every company in the marketing, analytics, or customer data space is building connectors into the data warehouse today. So it's becoming easier than ever to get data into your data warehouse today, and that's why we think the data warehouse is the right place to solve these customer data integration problems. We don't think this was the case 10 years ago, but we do think it is today because there's so many SaaSes that make it so easy to get data into your data warehouse, whether that's just turning on a flip of the switch in Google Analytics 360 to get all your data from your Google Analytics platform flowing into BigQuery, or whether that's, going to Segment and saying I want my data to show up in Postgres or Redshift, or whether that's even going into something like Fivetran and saying, here are the 7 SaaS services that my company uses, and I want the data from all of them into the data warehouse. So we think it's become easier than ever to get data into the data warehouse today. But in terms of looking forward to how this data can be made more and more useful, with things like CDC and lower latency requirements, a lot of these systems that get data into data warehouse today, in terms of SaaS services, are loading data every hour or every 30 minutes or every some interval that's not super low latency. And that provides bottlenecks on how you can actually use the data. For example, for providing contextual information to customer support representatives, we find that a hard space to get into from Hightouch, because customer support representatives oftentimes don't want to see data that's 30 minutes old because the customer is doing something in the app today and they want to see that information on the sidebar of their Zendesk. So if they have that data flowing from their data warehouse into Zendesk via Hightouch and it's out of date, then the customer support representative is going to be very confused when they're actually addressing this customer's ticket. If they're talking about an order that they just made on the site, but there's no order showing up on the Zendesk sidebar. So ingestion latency and the rate at which all these services are pushing data into the data warehouse is definitely a large issue, and one that's not just going to be needed to be fixed inside of the data warehouse's platforms themselves, but also one that the whole market is going to have to adapt to, as in everyone writing into the data warehouses should be aware that you can actually write into them in lower latencies now and use things like streaming APIs and have better interfaces to do this sort of stuff. So we think it's something that's definitely going to happen, but it'll take some time. The other interesting area in terms of upstream services of Hightouch in the data warehouse, helping you get data into the data warehouse, is data modeling. So an interesting trend these days that we're seeing is that with the sophistication of these new data warehouses, in particular the separate of compute and storage, it's actually possible to do a lot of data modeling work that used to have to be done outside the data warehouse pre-processing. Now it's actually possible to do that inside the data warehouse post-processing. So this is the whole shift from basically the ETL, extract, transform, then load way of thinking, to the ELT, which is extract, load, and then transform way of thinking, which companies like dbt and Fivetran are really advocating for. And we're really excited about this because it basically means that now that you can do all this transformation inside the data warehouse, there's no excuse for platforms not having a good way to just get data into the data warehouse. One of the hardest parts about building connectors into data warehouses previously was deciding on the right way to model that data in the data warehouse. When we were at Segment, we struggled thinking about this a lot because it's very hard to give analysts data in the data warehouse in a format that makes a generic format that makes sense for all businesses. Because in the end, every business is unique. But now that a lot of this transformation can be done within the data warehouse itself, we're seeing providers like Fivetran just dump JSON into Snowflake for some of their newer integrations, since customers can actually manipulate that data as they see fit within Snowflake using the JSON functions that are available inside of SQL. So overall, we've seen this movement to ELT and the separation of storage and compute inside of the data warehouses make it way easier for both companies to get data into data warehouses as vendors and as customers, which we're really excited about because Hightouch really never wants to focus on data collection. We just want to help people activate the data that they already have in their warehouse.
In terms of the actual engineering effort, you have a bit of an N times M problem of integration where you need to be able to support multiple source data warehouses and then a higher number of downstream tools. And all of those systems are going through their own process of evolution and modifying the interfaces that they have available, either to improve the capabilities or add new attributes or deprecate old attributes. And I'm wondering how you've structured your overall efforts in order to be able to stay up to date and keep up with the rate of change.
To be completely honest, I don't think that this is a massive challenge in terms of N times M for Hightouch. And the reason being that most of the types of data that people are utilizing and passing to these downstream tools are composed of pretty simple data types. So in Hightouch, once we query a customer's data warehouse, whether it's a Postgres or a Redshift or BigQuery or Snowflake, or even some data lake like Presto, we kind of convert it into a central format on our end that from there we start thinking about how does this data flow to Salesforce, or how does this data flow to HubSpot, or how does this data flow to Marketo. We don't really build like point-to-point integrations like here's how we do Postgres to Salesforce, here's how we do Postgres to Marketo. Instead, we're basically thinking of Postgres, Redshift, BigQuery, et cetera, to a high-touch data format. You can think of it as like a JSON, things that has like the type of this field and things like that. And then from that format, we think about how to get data to various different business systems. So that core abstraction is definitely something that's very, very useful, both for us and for our customers, as you might imagine. In the long term, I think just like BI tools, like companies don't want offerings like Hightouch or even dbt or a BI tool to be a part of the data warehouse platform because they want to be agnostic between different data warehouse platforms. And when a company moves from one data warehouse platform to another, they want to be able to use the same BI tools and ETL tools and tools like Hightouch on top of them. So this central abstraction of data into kind of a high-touch generic SQL format before we get it into each destination is pretty key to both us and our customers.
In terms of the overall data warehouse market, what are some of the trends that you're keeping a close eye on and that you're particularly excited for?
In general, for the whole data warehouse market, I am really particularly excited about streaming. Well, first, I always like to say that I think nightly jobs do solve business problems. So a lot of companies sometimes in first reaction think, oh, you're built off the data warehouse, you're going to be slow. That's what the market has kind of told them. Batch processing is getting pretty fast. There's companies like JetBlue using dbt and getting data into Snowflake on frequencies as low as 2 minutes. So that's pretty fast. Batch processing doesn't have to be nightly. They are right to some extent. There are actually bottlenecks when it comes to the latency that in which you can ingest data and then transform data through data warehouses themselves, as well as the wider ecosystem. Like software like dbt is really meant to run in batch today. So personally, I'm super excited about the addition of streaming features and incremental computation features to these data warehouse platforms, because I think it unlocks so many potentials and removes the biggest reason not to use a data warehouse in data infrastructure projects. At Segment, we built some complicated pipelines that had parallel computation going on in a data warehouse for batch processing and also stream processing systems. You think like Apache Flink or Spark Streaming. And this was very complicated. So I'm really excited for someone to finally solve the problem of streaming SQL and democratize access to this technology. So in particular, I'm excited for how Materialize is approaching it from ground up. And I think that there will definitely be operational use cases which it makes sense to use Materialize for. I'm also excited to see how AWS, Google, and Snowflake position themselves and build solutions to the streaming problem within their platform, even if it's like a 70% solution or something that's not as good as the niche database. I'm really excited for that technology to be democratized and become just a standard so that when people think of SQL, they don't think of batch. They don't just think of streaming. They don't just think of batch, but they just think of the best way to manipulate data. In terms of other things that I'm excited about in the data warehouse ecosystem, streaming lends its way well into this, but I'm excited for Snowflake in general to just offer more and more access patterns on top of the data warehouse. So Snowflake has already started releasing things like the ability to run Python and Java jobs on top of Snowflake and data that exists in Snowflake, in addition to just the SQL that you can run on Snowflake. With all these different access patterns, whether it's SQL executed in batch, SQL executed in streaming, Python and Java jobs executed on top of Snowflake, I'm really excited about Snowflake's vision of creating a data cloud where it's not just a data warehouse technology, it's not just a stream processing technology, it's not just a batch code execution engine like Spark, but it's a repository of customer data that can be operated on in many different access patterns in a way that's scalable. Because I don't think SQL is the end all. I think it is great for 90% of use cases, and I think it's here to stay. But there are things that are undoubtedly hard to do in SQL. For example, if you try to implement complex like entity resolution logic that needs to recurse or try to form something like a graph in SQL, you need to have multiple executions and multiple iterations over the data. But if you try to do something like this in Python or using GraphX and Spark, it can be a lot simpler. The difference is that the systems are not as accessible. You don't have all your customer data in them already. They're hard to run, they're hard to operate. And I want to see Snowflake's, the accessibility of the powerful execution engine that Snowflake has today for SQL. I'm really excited to see that expanded to a bunch of different access patterns so that data engineers can just operate on data however they'd like, rather than having to use a new system that's specialized whenever they hit constraints of the existing systems.
And in terms of the ways that you're seeing Hightouch being used, what are some of the most interesting or unexpected or innovative projects that you've seen built with it?
So I think one of the most interesting projects built with Hightouch today, actually not use cases of just syncing data into business tools like Salesforce and Facebook ads. That solves business problems, but it's not super cool, to be honest. I think what's super cool is people powering customer experiences off of Hightouch. So you might think, what is a company like Optimizely, which allows you to, have personalized A/B tests or just personalization in general off some customer data, like a Boolean flag for a user or a score. Optimizely can basically serve this to your front end in a low latency API that's globally distributed and available around the world, and then allows your front end to tailor the experience of your site based on that user, whether it's personalization or an A/B test or an experiment. If you think about companies like Optimizely and Dynamic Yield that basically do this, they're really just a thin layer around your customer data, exposing a different access pattern, which is a low latency API that's available on the front end of your site globally, just off of a particular subset of customer data. And really, it would make a lot more sense for services like this to be built on the data warehouse, which has all your customer data and is where your data scientists and engineers, analysts are pushing new definitions and models about the users. We see a lot of companies today when we talk to data science teams and data engineering teams tell us about how an analyst or data scientist does research on what should drive certain personalized customer experiences in their data warehouse using SQL. But then the product engineering team goes off and re-implements this as just code inside of their application API to actually serve those experiences to the customers or inside of their front end. And we're excited about a world where data from the warehouse can not just be operationalized for business intelligence use cases and for syncing data to SaaS services, but where it can be operationalized for powering actual customer experiences. And we're already seeing customers do this today in terms of just starting to push data from their data warehouse in Hightouch into production systems like Postgres, and then use those production systems like Postgres to serve personalized experiences with fast single row lookups inside of their apps. So that's something we've had customers push us to that we weren't initially thinking about, and we're super excited about the future of. We think Postgres and MySQL, et cetera, destinations are just a start. And down the road, we'll probably be investing in things like a low latency personalized API that's completely driven off the data in your data warehouse. So just give us a SQL query. We'll make sure the data gets into this API and is available in low latency, like from your front end with some sort of authentication. So we're super excited about the whole ability of powering true customer experiences off the data warehouse. We don't think there's a good way to do this today in the market. And we think the way that companies are doing this internally ad hoc is really wasteful a lot of the times because they haven't thought about the potential to use the data warehouse for this purpose.
In terms of your own experience of building the Hightouch platform and growing the capabilities and the customer base, what are some of the most interesting or unexpected or challenging lessons that you've learned?
The biggest one to be, there's a lot of challenges in scaling an integrations platform. We've already acknowledged that we're going to be an integrations company to some extent, in that we're going to need to be really good and diligent about how we interact with the third-party services on the back end. How do we do things like backoffs, retry? How do we QA every possible case of errors that can come back from a destination? And how do we find them before our customers? Once we find these errors, how do we show them to our users in a way that's understandable? How do we proactively alert them about these errors? How do we warn them before these errors happen by looking in their data? And this comes with a lot of challenges, both challenges because you're dealing with third parties. You don't have complete control over them. You actually don't have complete visibility in how they work either. You have their APIs, which are a public interface to them. And in addition, it comes with a lot of challenges in just creating the right abstractions internally in your own infrastructure. Abstractions that are neither too light so that it's really easy for someone to make a mistake when building your 300th integration, but abstractions that are also not too heavy in that it becomes hard to build a new integration because in destination 200 doesn't work the same way as destination 100. So thankfully, a number of people from our founding team used to work at Segment, including myself, and we've faced these challenges before. We've built abstractions that are too heavy, and we've built abstractions that are too light, and we've seen abstractions that weren't built for a long time because of core tech debt. We're figuring out ways to build these as early as possible with Hightouch. I think that's one of the biggest technical challenges we have today. In addition, another big technical challenge that exists today is just maintaining that hybrid architecture and figuring out ways that we can work with more and more compliance and security sensitive companies. We have a lot of interesting ideas on our roadmap, including kind of proxying the data and working on an encrypted format so that customer data doesn't even pass through our infrastructure in a visible way. We don't store it today, but let's think about a way that doesn't even pass through it. So Very Good Security is a company, the security space, that's built some really innovative stuff here. We're excited to check out their work. Other things are like, how do we connect to companies that have their data warehouse completely blocked off to the public internet? We've built some stuff here around reverse SSH tunneling is a term we use for it. So I think one, just scaling and maintaining an integrations platform that's better than building scripts in-house is a big challenge. And two, handling super compliance and security sensitive companies is a large challenge, both organizationally and in terms of your go-to-market and sales, but also technically.
For people who are looking to be able to integrate their data warehouse into some of these different downstream systems or just the overall space of data integrations, what are the cases where Hightouch is the wrong choice?
So off the bat, one of the cases where Hightouch is the wrong choice is when you don't have the data you need in a data warehouse. When you don't have the data you need in a data warehouse, it's definitely the wrong choice because we don't help you get data into the data warehouse. If you do have a process to do that, 90% of your data is in the data warehouse and 10% is not, then it's probably the right choice. But if you just don't have a data warehouse in general, it might be the wrong choice. We do think there's a lot of opportunity in helping companies end-to-end. So you go from zero to solving problems in their Salesforce account by creating a warehouse, getting the data you need into it, and then using Hightouch. We think with all these services going self-service, pay-as-you-go, sign up online and just set it up, we think there's really an opportunity in building something awesome there. That said, it's not the right choice if you don't have a data warehouse today. Another reason that Hightouch might not be the right choice is if you don't have people who can write SQL accessible to you on your team. The organizations that we work with, they either have the users using Hightouch can write SQL, or they have access to someone who can write SQL or paste a SQL query for them really easily. But that's not always the matter of the world. And there are integration platforms like Zapier, for example, that allow you to build point-to-point integrations between two services without using SQL. So if every time a ticket gets added to Jira, you want to do something in Salesforce, and you don't have someone who can write SQL or really help you think about that holistically, then a platform like Zapier can be better because it's been built for a different audience. And we don't really intend to compete with that audience or that user. We intend to focus on the technical user and people with data warehouses. Lastly, I should mention that we do have some features for kind of visually tweaking SQL queries, doing stuff like marketing segmentation on top of the data warehouse. But even to use those features, you need to have a data team or someone accessible with nearby that knows SQL to set them up and connect the data warehouse in the first place. But yeah, I think two reasons off the bat that you wouldn't want to use Hightouch are really if you don't have the data you need in a warehouse or accessible in SQL, and two, you may have data in SQL available, but you may not have anyone who knows how to query it accessible to you, in which case it really makes sense to use something like Zapier instead, because those tools really have like an if this, then do kind of workflow for business users. Another reason that it definitely doesn't make sense to use Hightouch is if you need extremely low latency in terms of responding to new data and ingesting data. Data warehouses are generally not suited for this today. That said, I would emphasize that more and more companies are figuring out ways to get data into data warehouses faster and faster. So you may not need a real-time system, even if you think you do. As in, we've seen JetBlue on DBT forums getting data into their data warehouse as low as 2 minutes and using it for things like predicting flight delays, which is super interesting. And it just shows the potential of even doing batch processing faster. So if you do need true real-time use cases or more event-based systems, then the data warehouse might not be the right choice for you as well.
Are there any other aspects of the work that you're doing at Hightouch or the overall space of customer data and the work that you're doing for data integrations that we didn't discuss yet that you'd like to cover before we close out the show?
One thing that I think is just an interesting concept is today there's kind of a dichotomy that we have in the market. You can either use tools that are built more generically to handle data. Like Looker offers a visual interface to slice and dice data, but it's pretty generic. It's not built for customer data. It's not built for use cases like analyzing user funnels. Or you can use tools like, Mode Analytics or Periscope or Tableau that lets you run SQL on top of your data set. But basically, you can either use these generic platforms to understand and operate on your customer data if you want it to be on your own server or on your own warehouse, or you can use these higher level tools that operate on their own data set and have their own siloed data set about your customer information. So these tools are things like Mixpanel or Amplitude or Salesforce, as an example. That's not really seen as a digital customer data platform as much, but really is. So I think there's this interesting dichotomy where you either get the generic tool on your data or the nice UI on someone else's data. I think that's going to be patched over time. Companies like Indicative are building Amplitude-like functionality directly on top of your own data warehouse. I think that has a lot of potential. Inside of Hightouch, we have a visual mode that does need to be set up by a SQL literate user, someone who understands the data models. But you can actually expose some of those transformed models that you're creating in your data warehouse to marketers to do specific tasks like audience segmentation before they run an ad campaign. And I think that Visual SQL gets a really bad rep. But if you think about what tools like Amplitude and Mixpanel are doing, they're essentially generating SQL queries on their backend to compute what you're seeing in the UI. So I think Visual SQL gets a bad rep a lot of the time because SQL builders just look like SQL expression builders. Like click here to add a where clause, click here to add a select, click here to add a join. But I think there's a lot of potential for nice visual UIs that help people solve very specific purposes, like segmenting users, for example, in a marketing use case, directly on top of your own data store. I don't think this dichotomy really has to exist. And I'm super excited for all the companies in that space, including what we're working on at Hightouch. Though we're not trying to give this in a magical way on top of your data warehouse. We still need a technical user to set it up, which I think is inevitable, and you have to embrace that. So yeah, I'm super excited with where things are going in that space, and I think that it's an age-old problem that has been overlooked in a lot of ways.
For anybody who wants to follow along with the work that you're doing or get in touch, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And as a final question, I'd like to get your perspective on what you see as being the biggest gap in the tooling or technology that's available for data management today.
Outside of the stuff that I already mentioned around streaming, I think the biggest gap in the tooling of actual data management today is probably around lineage and metadata, understanding what does this column mean in the data warehouse, or how is it being used by my teams across different BI functions, where is it going? Like, is this column going into a system like Salesforce? Or what does this column in Salesforce actually mean? I think those questions are still extremely hard to answer. Part of it's a technology problem. A lot of it, in my perspective, is a people problem. I know a lot of people are building different platforms for metadata and lineage and things like that. But I think a lot of it will have to come down to a people problem until things are super standardized amongst different companies. But in general, it's not a space that I hold super strong opinions on, but it's a space that I'm very excited about.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time today and sharing the work that you're doing at Hightouch and the experiences you've had working so closely with users of data warehouses and enabling them to make multiple uses of their data much easier. Definitely an interesting problem to solve and an interesting approach to that. So I appreciate all the time and effort you've put in, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Sweet. Thank you for having me. Have a nice day.
Listening. Don't forget to check out our other show, podcast.init, at pythonpodcast.com to learn about the Python language, its community, and the innovative ways it is being used. And visit the site at dataengineeringpodcast.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the mailing list, and read the show notes. If you've learned something or tried out a project from the show, then tell us about it. Email hosts at dataengineeringpodcast.com with your story. And to help other people find the show, please leave a review on iTunes and tell your friends and coworkers.